In just 9 days, we'll have access to Resident Evil 4 Remake, which, as I've said in several videos now, is currently my most anticipated game. It just looks like the best kind of remake. It wants to remain entirely faithful to the original work while also bringing in new gameplay features and design choices the team could make with the benefit of hindsight. Visually looking stunning and very fun to play. Capcom has been on fire with Resident Evil these last several years, and I think the new RE4 is going to be yet another example. But of course, there'll be plenty of time to talk about that when it releases next Friday. This just gets me thinking about the original Resident Evil 4, which I reviewed back in December. Something that video went into was the fact that RE4 has been released on a million different consoles at this point. Pretty much every console that has existed since the release of the game has had a port of RE4 except the original Xbox, I suppose. In that review from a few months ago, I covered the ports of this game in a bit of a lightning round, going over some various stats on each, like how it was the PS3 and 360 ports that first brought the game to HD, but it wasn't until the PS4 and Xbox One where it was 60 FPS, that sort of thing. And for most ports of RE4, that's pretty much all there is to say. But there are a few that do have a little more going on than just putting the game on a new console. Introducing the other remakes of Resident Evil 4. And that's not including the mobile phone / Zeebo demakes of RE4 that you can find plenty of material of on YouTube already. No, I mean to say that today I'm going to cover two versions of RE4 that add a lot more to the experience than just the GameCube original on a higher resolution. Resident Evil 4 is released on the Nintendo Wii, and more importantly, RE4 is released on the Oculus Quest 2. The VR version is the main attraction, obviously, so if you want to only hear about that, you can skip to this time in the video, as will be most of the video's runtime. But I figured I'd go over RE4 on the Wii since I actually did not in my original video. It's not even really a remake, but go along with it. Many players swear by RE4's Wii port being the definitive version because its main innovation was full pointer aiming with the Wii remote. Despite the fact that I have owned this copy of the game for a while now, I've never actually played it before today. I wasn't sure what I was going to think of it since my attitude has always been, I'm sure the aiming is nice, but is it so great that it's better to play it on the Wii than it is to play it in 4K 60 on PC? Well, the answer to that is, nah, I would still rather play the game on PC, but that doesn't make it without merit. I can see why people enjoy it the most. As I said, the main draw for this version was that you point the Wii remote at the screen and shoot your enemies with the reticle. Said reticle going from green to red when your shot is going to connect with a target. The basic gameplay loop from the original RE4 is still intact with this new control scheme. The tension comes from the fact that while aiming, Leon cannot move, so you have to pick your shots carefully as a result. What you want to do is aim for weak spots and then inflict damage with melee attacks. It's fully RE4, just with the extra dimension that you're the one doing the aiming, which adds an extra layer of immersion to the experience. And for a relatively early release Wii game, they did wonders with the pointing controls as it plays as well as it did on release, judging by reading the reviews, that is. Personally, I did have some issues with it though. I thought the button mapping wasn't what I was expecting. You use the C and Z buttons on the nunchuck for running and pulling out the knife, when I was expecting running at least to be on the Wii remote itself. However, the A button is the shoot button, which admittedly does feel right, and the B button is how you equip weapons and cancel selections. What's really going on here is that this is more of a nitpick about how I don't like the layout of the Wii remote and the dynamic of it and the nunchuck. I just think the Wii remote doesn't have a lot of buttons, and there only being one stick is just awkward. It's just a bizarre console at the end of the day, one that was completely divorced from the competition, the PS3 and the Xbox 360 in pretty much every category. The hardware was leagues behind, the visuals were not up to that standard, it's not HD, it had a motion-controlled gimmick, and the list goes on. Yet it proved to be a big hit. I'm just not particularly into it. However, I didn't play this on my original Wii. Instead, I just decided to bust out the Wii U and play it via backwards compatibility, as it's easy to plug and play with having HDMI output. Must say, I was not expecting to drag the Wii U out of the box I keep it in so soon after the last time I had to do that, but here we are. I don't think it's fair to say I don't like how it controls, because I got used to it after a few minutes, it just wasn't what I was expecting. And I did like how you can reload your gun by shaking the Wii remote while aiming, that felt intuitive, although I don't like shaking the Wii remote for QTEs. It's the same thing as button mashing, but it just makes my wrist hurt. But again, small stuff. The actual issue I had with RE4 on the Wii was how aiming worked with the camera. In this game, you point the Wii remote to aim, like I said, however the Wii remote only controls the pointer, not the camera. The pointer will only go to the edges of the screen, but it won't move Leon at all. Instead, you have to use the analog stick on the nunchuck while pointing in order to actually change what Leon is facing. This was pretty awkward, I gotta say. When playing a shooting game with a controller, including ports of RE4 predating the Wii one, you hold down the aim button and use the left analog stick to control the aim. The character's movement is replaced with camera movement. Here, aiming and the camera are two separate actions. This is actually pretty common in other games, however these are games where moving and aiming is a possibility, so you need to control the character with one stick and aim with the other. However, in RE4, you can't move and aim at the same time, so having two different ways of pointing the gun just felt awkward as I'd point the pointer towards the edge of the screen to move it and then realize it doesn't work like that. You could get used to this as well, however like I said, I would rather just play it on PC as I'm much more comfortable with that. What doesn't help is that my nunchuck is old. So when I started playing it, it was working just fine, but then I noticed it was Joy-Con drifting mid-session, and by the end it was completely unplayable, and I don't have another nunchuck, so I figured I had seen enough. RE4 on Wii is pretty good, all things considered. At the time of its release, I'd say it was the best version of the game simply because of its added motion-based aiming, a really good demonstration of what shooters on the Wii could be like. And in addition to that, this is a world where there were only 4 versions of the game: the GameCube original, the PS2, the old Windows version, and the Wii version. The Wii version, for console players, blended the best of both worlds as it had the visual and sound quality from the GameCube version, but then it also had the content added in the PS2 version like a proper 16:9 mode and the extra gameplay modes like Separate Ways, while also providing a new experience with the aiming. Although upon doing some research for this video, I found out that the Wii version does support the classic controller and the GameCube controller. I mean, I could have looked at the back of the box to see that, but still. So that means that if you don't like the new aiming, which I thought had pros and cons, you can just play it like the original if you want. But still, it's 480p and 30 FPS when you can play it in 4K and 60 FPS today. Most certainly the game's best port as of 2007, but in 2023 I just think better options exist for this game, even if it can be enjoyed. With that said, let's take off the kid gloves and get into the meat of the video: RE4 on the Oculus Quest 2. When this first got announced back in 2021, I got a bit confused. There were early reports that Capcom was doing a full-blown remake of Resident Evil 4, but then we got a reveal trailer for the VR port of the game. Was this the Resident Evil 4 remake? In that case, fair enough, it is a new way to play the game that takes nothing away from the original. However, it was actually 2 different projects. One meant to rebuild Resident Evil 4, and the other meant to do it in a whole new way. I had to admit, RE4 in VR looked pretty cool. However, there was and is a large issue with playing this game, and that is that it's exclusive to the Oculus Quest 2 headset. No PlayStation VR port or anything like that. For myself and for many others, this simply meant we weren't going to play regardless of how good it actually was, because the Oculus Quest 2 isn't cheap, and to use it for one game you can clear in a weekend would feel like a serious waste of resources. But then the reviews came out when the game was released back in 2021, and it turned out that this VR port was in fact a great way to play the original in an interesting new way. I knew I wanted to play it someday, but again, I wasn't going to buy the headset, so that was out. Then one day last year, I was talking to my friend Javon about RE4, and he was talking all about how he played the VR version in his own Oculus headset, and I was like, yo, mind if I borrow that for a video someday? And now that day is upon us, so special thanks to Javon for making the video a reality. If that speech didn't make it clear, VR is something I had never taken an interest in before. It seemed like a passing fad of the 90s that the technology didn't exist to support. But then it made a real comeback in the 2010s when the tech did exist to do it justice, and we've seen a plethora of VR games released in the last several years. I might even buy the PlayStation VR headset so I can play the new RE4 in VR someday. It could be a funny which RE4 is the better VR game kind of video. But that's neither here nor there. What I was saying was that I've never used a VR anything before. I've witnessed other people play VR games at Christmas and other get-togethers, but I was never curious enough to try it myself, so for that reason this video is my very first time being in VR. It also meant that everything took forever to set up, from installing Oculus on my PC to figuring out how I was supposed to record the thing. As far as I can tell, the only way to record Oculus games is by streaming them to a private website link and then capturing that in OBS. But the issue with that is that the quality is absolutely abysmal. Streaming is down to just having a good internet connection or not, and I guess I don't. For that reason, my gameplay is crustier than a prison toilet, which is honestly a shame because the game looks quite sharp when you see it through the headset. The developers have gone the extra mile and rebuilt the game from scratch and remade a whole bunch of textures to make them HD. It looks great when you're in the action, the footage just doing it no justice. I also decided to capture myself in the corner in the event of a reaction of mine that was funny, although this merely proved to me why my Let's Play career never took off. Still more? It is a funny visual though, as what feels like intense action while playing just looks like a drunk looking around in the replay. Or worse. In Session 2, I started drifting behind the view of the microphone as well, but in my defense, I literally couldn't see anything, so how was I supposed to know that? Is it clear that I've never used a VR device before? Sometimes I'd bump into the keyboard and that would cancel the recording. Another part saw me recording a black screen for an hour. It was quite something to record the game, but I did beat the entire thing in about 9 hours. So with all that admin out of the way, how did it go once I finally started playing RE4 in VR? Forgive me for the incoming idiot statement, but man, starting this was so cool. I mean, it's RE4, but I am in it. The title screen is the church in the village, and when I look up, I can see the ceiling and all that. It's really cool that my first ever experience with virtual reality was RE4, a world I've run around in dozens of times, but now it's in first person. Again, idiot statement because, yeah, that's how VR works, but still, I thought it was pretty cool. As for the actual game, I thought the controls were very intuitive. I was just saying a few moments ago that I never really liked the Wii Remote and nunchuck dynamic, thought it was a limiting factor, but on the Oculus you have a twin stick setup just with 2 controller hands that have 4 buttons each, all the aiming being done with your hands, one of the shoulder buttons shooting and the other grabbing. Accessing the inventory and game functions like kicking being done with the buttons. You move with the left stick and use the right stick to quickly look from left to right, holding it down to quick turn and then using your eyes to look around in more depth. As I said, it all felt pretty intuitive, with the exception of pushing things. Numerous times you'll have to press buttons or click things up close, and I don't think the game was designed for you to have a desk and computer in front of you, clearly. I kept bumping into the desk and therefore wasn't able to reach things properly and would have to reposition myself to do so. Those moments were pretty awkward, but the actual controls felt great. With that said, there are numerous options for the player to pick from, such as picking your dominant hand, setting whether you're sitting or standing, your height, and all that. But then options that are geared around the player's comfort with VR. The way I had it by default was that you would have to click the right stick over and over to turn the camera in set increments. But I saw I could change it to a full rotation, and that's what I did because it was much more natural to look around that way. You can actually turn off cutscene QTEs, which I greatly appreciated since I hate motion-based QuickTime events. It's too subjective as to whether or not you're doing it right. I felt like I was doing the motion, but oftentimes the game would just disagree, causing me to get grabbed in the air during the Salazar boss fight again and again. I don't think I've ever actually seen what happens if you get hit in this QTE once in my life, but now I sure have. So removing those from cutscenes was appreciated. The biggest option in the game would be how the weapon switching works. You can choose between an immersive mode and a more game-like quick swap. I picked the second option because of the fact that in immersive mode, equipping the knife from my chest just felt awkward for the same reason as motion QTEs, where I felt like I was doing it right but the game wasn't in agreement, and I thought that would be bad for me in a regular combat situation. A weapon wheel is much simpler. Although from what I gather, you have much more freedom in immersive mode. I think this is how you dual wield your weapons, like the shotgun in one hand and the handgun in the other, which sounds pretty cool, but I picked the safer option because I've never played a VR game before. Once I was in the game, I was pleasantly surprised. Because when you say RE4 in VR, it seems like it would be a gimmick, but the game was tastefully converted to the new format, remaining faithful to the original game but adapting things for the VR setting, like the inventory screen. You still have to work with a grid system that expands as the game goes on, but now you sort the items in this case by dragging and dropping them with your hands and dragging and dropping which things you want to sell and what weapons you want to upgrade. It's the exact same thing as the original, just done in a way that is perfect for VR. Although I don't like how there's no music when pausing, it kind of takes the tension out of the moment, but that's just a nitpick. I like how they've adapted the various puzzles of RE4 for the new version, like how you have to rotate this sphere around until you get the right symbol, or clicking the buttons to do certain things. Still not that difficult, but I liked how it was done, credit where it's due. The combat is where the game is at its best, which is no surprise because this is Resident Evil 4. One of the coolest things about the game in VR is where you have to manually reload your weapons. You can see how much ammo you have by looking at this wristwatch that Leon has, and when it's empty, you grab this ammo icon and load your weapon. Every weapon in the game having its own reload method, like having to pump the shotgun yourself after every shot, or by flicking the Magnum up after putting the new rounds into it and putting the magazine into the handgun, or reloading the Red 9 from the top. Despite the fact that the footage of reloading makes you look like a complete goober, the act of doing it is incredibly satisfying. Like with the shotgun, you can't help but feel pretty badass when you get ready for another shot. However, it has gameplay purposes too. You still upgrade your weapons with the merchant, reload speed being one of the upgrades you want to focus on in the original game because that would mean you'd spend more time in the action as reloading would stop you in place while enemies were after you. In VR, reload speed isn't an upgrade because the speed of reloading is just dependent on how good you are at it. So instead, this places extra priority on your maximum ammo count. The TMP, for example, is still a must-have weapon, but if you increase its maximum ammo count, you're able to blast off more shots before needing to reload, thus keeping you in the action more. Not to say that that's not true in the original, but when reloading is on you, it just feels more urgent. The stock for the TMP in the original game was important in stabilizing your aim for it. Now, the TMP is a weapon you need both hands to use effectively. And while the stock still absorbs recoil, above all else, I noticed it made it easier to use the weapon single-handedly. For other weapons like the handguns or the rifles, I just found that using my non-dominant hand to steady my aim was really natural. It's examples like this where I feel like the mechanics might be very different from the original game, but in spirit it evokes the same kind of feeling, which is the best compliment I can give a game like RE4 VR. One of the biggest shifts in the dynamic of RE4 is how you can run and shoot in this game. You can change this in the options if you want, but I feel like it's a benefit to the VR experience that would detract from the original. RE4 got tension from the fact that aiming was slow and stationary against an army of aggressive enemies. RE4 VR places you in the action. It's more immersive to be able to move and shoot. Plus, the player had a better view of Leon's surroundings in the OG game, and in VR, you see what you see, and that's it. Giving the player the ability to run and shoot is an advantage the player has, but the first-person perspective is a more limited view, which created tension. So there were trade-offs in bringing the game to a new format that once again retains that original spirit. The devs play with sound in that sometimes you'll be able to directly hear what's going on right next to you, which provides some scares in combat. A lot of the bosses are where this game shines. Getting that first-person view in the Del Lago fight is really intense as you're looking around for where it might be and picking up the ammo from the boat to load the gun. Mechanically, it's not supremely different from how it was in 2005, but this extra dimension brings out so much. Same for Chief Mendez, where you're looking up seeing him scale the pipes and all that. It just feels more intense. Same goes for having regenerators in your face. RE4 VR makes a much scarier game than it ever was originally, and that's worthy of a lot of praise. And that's pretty much all I can say. I played the entire game, and it was RE4, but done excellently in VR. The only thing I can see players of the original not enjoying as much be how some of the cutscenes have been edited down.
Small world, eh? Well, I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics, too.
How rude! And I don't believe there's any relevance with my figure and my standing. Who are you?
Oh, excuse me, Your Highness. Small world, eh?
Who are you?
Oh, excuse me, Your Highness.
The issue here is changing the context of scenes to remove gauche humor, but on the whole, can't say I mind, since the developers clearly showed effort with the cutscenes in other ways, like how Leon will use whatever handgun he has equipped during cutscenes, like him using the Red 9 in this cabin scene, when the original he just used the handgun in every scene even if it wasn't in your inventory anymore. I was quite surprised by that, and then also quite happy to see modern standards like subtitles included. I don't want my fan card to be revoked for this, but if I didn't read this was an issue with this version of the game on Wikipedia, I wouldn't have noticed it was even a thing. I've played RE4 quite a lot, but I almost skip all the cutscenes anyway, so I'm glad I decided to read up on this before playing, or else I would have skipped them all again, thus making this talking point something the video wouldn't have even had. At the end of the day, I don't mind, because like I said, RE4 has appeal to this day, and that appeal was transferred over and then some in the VR port. Now, is it better than the original? No. I mean, RE4, as originally released, one of the most significant games ever released. It's easy to say nothing could ever compare to that. Until March 24th, that is. But seriously, I would definitely come back to the original over this, because VR just isn't my thing. I thought it was quite interesting and novel to play, but just for a weekend, not something I want to play a bunch of games in. So yeah, I'm not going to say it replaced the original, but that wasn't the idea here. They were trying to take RE4 and completely rebuild it from the ground up in the VR space, and I thought their work was stellar. In no regard did it feel forced or phoned in. It was a carefully considered VR adaptation of an iconic game, and it provides a lot of content for players who are interested in VR. RE4 is not a short game. It takes me about 10 hours to beat on every single playthrough, and then you have extra modes and weapons on top of that. RE4 is a game with a lot of content. So yeah, not better than the original, but excellent work. A fantastic way to experience RE4 in a new way, and definitely something I'd recommend to any hardcore fan of the game or the series, or just likes games in general, because the VR version of this was fantastic. Not much more I can say on it besides that. Now we just wait for the real prize. Resident Evil 4 Remake coming out next week. I don't need to repeat myself, it's gonna be hype, so I'll just wrap up and say yeah, that's what I'm covering next. So until then, I'll say what I always do. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.